So Judge Seeliger, I'm glad to have you back in the History Center. We've got your collection all organized, sorted, ready for viewing. So what we're doing today is going through some of your collection and some of your stories.
Voice recorder.
Related to your collection. And I'd like to start, and I know you're from originally the state of Washington, but today I'd like to start with your time when you came to DeKalb County, starting with Emory Law School, and then we'll move into the Maynard Jackson and Jimmy Carter affiliations.
Well, I can briefly start by saying I was born and raised in Seattle, and graduated from high school in Seattle. Then I went to the University of Washington, did my undergraduate work in political science there. And then when I got out, I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do. But I took a postulancy in the Episcopal Church. In other words, after I got out of the service, I was thinking about going to seminary. However, when I got into the Air Force, I served in a lot of different locations. First in San Antonio for training, and then Biloxi, Mississippi, at Keesler for training, and Hunter Air Force Base, in Savannah, and that's from where I volunteered to serve in Vietnam. So I served temporary duty in Vietnam for about 6 months, Vietnam and Thailand. And my job was to install communications gear at the new air bases that were being used to bomb North Vietnam. And that's what I did for about 6 months. I came back. After some experiences, which I'm not going to go into in Vietnam, I decided that the priesthood was not for me. And so meanwhile, I had met Gwen in Biloxi, Mississippi. She was a chemical engineer. And we kind of liked each other. But then we separated when I went to Savannah. Then she took a job in the space program down in Michoud. And she was one of the very few female engineers in the space program. She graduated from Auburn University with a degree in chemical engineering. And then after she left there, she came to Atlanta to work at Lockheed, Georgia. And about that time was when I was getting out of the Air Force. And so that's when I came here to be with her. I also had been accepted at Emory, which was kind of a surprise. I think the dean took pity on me because I was a Vietnam vet. And so he thought, well, okay, I'll give him a chance, even though his academic record isn't all that great. And it wasn't. So anyway, that's when I started law school. When I started law school at Emory, there was a young man by the name of Maynard Jackson teaching here. He was teaching poverty law. And I did not sit in any of his courses at that time, but he was the only African American in the area, and I just kind of got to know him. And we became pretty good friends. At the end of that year, I signed up for the Southern Regional Council. Now, Southern Regional Council was sponsored by the Methodist Church. It was designed to improve race relations, but it received funding from the Ford Foundation and the Field Foundation, so it's a pretty large organization. And so I began as an intern, and while an intern, I ran into some very significant people. I met Julian Bond, John Lewis, and Vernon Jordan. Vernon Jordan was the director of the Voter Education Project, which was a subsidiary of the Southern Regional Council, and they were engaged in registering African Americans to vote. In 1965, 2 years earlier, the Voting Rights Act had been passed, and so they took it upon themselves to get involved as a private organization to recruit voters. At the same time, Julian Bond and John Lewis, they both became friends of mine. Julian less so, but John pretty close. I was really not aware of his record of what happened in Selma, Alabama. And I wasn't really aware that he was involved in the bus demonstrations. Bus students were doing that because, especially when Selma took place, I was in Vietnam, and I just did not know what was going on. And so, I did not know that he was at the civil rights gathering with Martin Luther King in 1963. Although I think I saw part of that when I was stationed at that point in Hunter, but I I didn't remember her being on the program. So we were kind of co-equals, if you will. We were about the same age. I was 27 and he was 29. And we got to know each other really well. Julian later, and then one of the reasons we got to know each other in particular is that Julian and John were co-presidents of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, but they got run out by Stokely Carmichael, who was a Black Power advocate. And they were both both at Southern Regional Council. Now, they also wanted to form a delegation, a challenge delegation, if you will, for the Democratic Party convention in 1968. The state's delegation was selected by, of all people, Lester Maddox. So you can imagine what his composition was, very conservative people and the like. So a bunch of labor leaders and a bunch of civil rights leaders gathered in Macon, Georgia at the Dempsey Hotel to elect a delegation to challenge the Lester Maddox delegation before the qualifications committee at the Democratic Convention. I went down to that. I still remember seeing Julian. Julian has a dry sense of humor. He walked up to me and he said, "Well, Chuck, now who do you think is best qualified to be chairman of this delegation?" And I looked at him and said, "Julian, I can't think of anyone more qualified than you." He kind of smiled and said, "I like the way you think, Chuck." He moved on. But anyway, he was elected, and so was John. They were co-chairs of that delegation. And when they went there, they did depose the traditional delegation for the Democratic Party, as Lester Maddox and his crew were thrown out, and they were replaced by this challenge delegation. And meanwhile, Julian became famous because he's 32 years old at that point. They wanted to nominate him for vice president, and there was a movement within the convention to do that. But unfortunately, he was 32 years old, and the age limit for the vice president, you had to be at least 35. So that was the end of his political career as vice president of the United States. About the same time, John and I got to continue to be friends, but Julian was moving on. He actually had national aspirations at that point, so we kind of lost him, didn't see him. But John came back to the Southern Regional Council, and at that point, I ran into Maynard Jackson. He was coming down an elevator, and I was just about to get on. He had offices apparently in the old Journal building where all of this took place. And he said, "Chuck, I'm going to run for the United States Senate against Herman Talmadge. Will you help me?" And I said, "I think so." So I then talked to the people at the Southern Regional Council, and I said, "Yeah, I think it'd be great. He's going to be the first Black man to run for a statewide Georgia office since Reconstruction. And so we want him to encourage the newly registered Black voters to come to Georgia." So it became part of the fact, very much part of a civil rights movement, even though in fact it was a political thing. And I worked on the campaign. It's a very interesting campaign. The chair of the campaign was Chuck Williams, a Black man, very competent, kind of a public relations kind of guy, perfect for the job. Secretary was Faye Goldberg, and she was kind of the office coordinator, a Jewish woman. She was the wife of a doctor who was at Emory Hospital. And the third was Leonard Levine, who had worked with Maynard up in Philadelphia. He came down for the summer and that kind of helped out. And then there was me. And when I walked in, they kind of gave me the job as coordinator. So I ended up drawing the schedule for going statewide. I determined where the most areas that might be sensitive for someone like a Black man running in Georgia. It's a tough job, but we found them. Places like Savannah, Athens, Brunswick, Valdosta, cities, in other words. And then I also was an advancement. That is, I go in before him in some of these southern towns, get with the Black community and try to organize something so the Maynard came to have a reception.
What year was this, sir?
1968.
Thank you. Please continue.
So, I went on several, but there was one really noteworthy case, and that was the one when I went down to, we first went to, of all places, Tolover County in Central Georgia. I cannot remember the name. He was an civil rights organizer, and he was a farmer. So we first went to this gathering, and it must have been close to 3,000 people. It was really jammed with people. It was out on a farm. We were sitting at a farm, and I was sitting on top of a large wagon, so was Maynard. And Maynard made the major speech, and I made a speech talking about how we thought if you all would register to vote and all vote, Maynard has a chance to be elected. Maybe a little fanciful thinking, but we thought that. So anyway, after we completed that, then we drove down to Louisville. We were on our way to Savannah, but we stopped in Louisville at a church. And that was one of my first exposure to the black church. It was an AME church, and the place was full. And everybody was dressed up. All the men's coat tie, all the women were wearing their Sunday best and had caps on, little hats on. And Maynard made a speech. He brought down the house. I still remember the reverend. He said, "We're going to take up a collection for Brother Jackson. So we're going to pass the plates." And he said, "Well, I don't want to hear the disturbing clink of little coins. I want to hear the soft rush of paper as it is being placed." We raised a lot of money there. I can't remember how much it was. Chuck got it, of course. And then we went to a gas station afterwards. The gas station was kind of an old Texaco station, and it had a creamy in there. And there were a lot of white folks, old white folks sitting there shooting a breeze. And so Maynard went in. He had the guts of a caterpillar. He walked up to all these old white guys and said, "My name's Maynard Jackson. I'm running for the United States Senate." They shook hands and grabbed their hands, and they didn't even hand it out. Meanwhile, in another part of the gas station, it was a very large room, all these black families came in. Now, I don't know that had ever been integrated before, but all these black families came in and watched because they were worried about our security. We had a sheriff looking after us while we were at the church, but now we were leaving the church. And so Maynard got his car filled up. I had a Corvette. I had a Volkswagen riding behind him. And so he started to take off, and as I was going up to pay the bill from my car, I looked out to the right and I saw these 4 kids. They were teenagers driving an Oldsmobile Quadra-Light headquarters. I don't know if you're probably too young for that, but Oldsmobile went run for a couple of years. I think it's 67, 68, made headlights with Quadra-Lights, so there's 4 lights in the front and there. And I kind of noticed that. I didn't think much else out of it. So anyway, we got it. Maynard took off. He was ahead of me by about a half a mile. I was behind him. And behind me came a whole string of cars of black families. So they were from the congregation following us out of town, maybe about 20 of them. They were worried about us. So we didn't know we had anything to worry about. At one point at an intersection, they rang for lights and they took off, and I went on down. Then a few moments later, these Quadra-Lights that I saw earlier were coming at an amazing speed. I was going about 55 miles an hour. It's a country road leading to Highway 17. And this car came right behind me. And then he switched to the right, and then he switched to the left and knocked me off the road. And then I got back on the road. Luckily, I don't know why my Volkswagen didn't flip. It didn't. But it came out, and I got out of the ditch and came back out. And I ran by Maynard and stopped, and Maynard had stopped at the intersection of Highway 17 that goes south into Savannah. And so I walked up and he said, "What happened, Chuck?" And I said, "Nothing. I just got behind you. I didn't know what was going on." And he said, "Okay." I never told him about it until after the election, because after the election was completed, and then I felt I could tell him. But right now, everybody was so nervous. I didn't want to jack his nerves. So then he went down to Savannah, and I went with him. He hit a couple churches. I went to some of the white churches around the area. Didn't get a friendly welcome, but at least they were civil. Then we down to Brunswick. And at Brunswick, the strange thing happened. Chuck Williams said, "You're going to room with me." I'd been rooming with Maynard up to that point. I said, "Well, that's fine. What's going on?" "Well, you've become so negative about white folks. I don't think Maynard doesn't need that. He doesn't want to hear that now." So, because I'd really gotten angry. They didn't know that I'd been around off the road, but I was really upset. So anyway, then they went on to Valdosta, and then and they were going to stop at LaGrange, and I headed back up 85 to heading toward Atlanta. And I was in my Volkswagen again, and that bunch of yard signs in the back, and I thought, well, they're not doing me any good in the back of the car, so I decided to do something that I now know is perfectly illegal, posted signs on the Georgia Power lines as I went up the road. And I did that for me, put up about some 15, 20 signs. Then I put up the last sign, and then some kids, again in an older car, teenagers, got out of the car and started walking toward me. Now, I had to walk up to a hill to get to me. Because the poles were on a hill, maybe about 25 feet off the road. So as I turned around, and I had a big statement gun in my hand, of course, they walked toward me, and they were looking like they were coming for me. I think they thought I was, forgive my language, a candy-ass Yankee from New York or something. They didn't know they were taking on a guy who was a Vietnam veteran. He was 28 years old, mad as hell about what had happened earlier. So they came up the hill, they came after it, and they kind of surrounded me. And the big guy in the middle, again, they're not very old, they're about 16 or 17 years of age, tried to confront me. I had that statement gun on, I swung it at him. And I missed him, but he hit the ground, and everybody else was stunned. What's going on here? So I continued to walk up down to my car. Then they got back at me, and they followed me all the way to the Fulton County line, and then they turned around. Anyway, that's an old war story. I don't know if it's useful, but I just thought I'd tell it. Meanwhile, Maynard did very well in the election. He got 24% of the vote, and nearly all of it, and they figure on getting maybe 25% of the registered black voters in the state, and I were able to determine that it really did do the job. A lot of African Americans for the first time voted, and that was kind of important. Later, Maynard would run for vice mayor in 1969, and he asked me to work as a staffer in his campaign. I said, "No, Maynard, I'm in law school, I can't do it." He said, "Well, I will do some part stuff for you," and I worked as a night manager at his headquarters in Atlanta, maybe 3 times a week. Just kind of help the phone banks move and stand in the office and kind of watch things, things were all right. And Maynard won. He won by 54% of the vote. First black elected public official in Atlanta. 1973, he ran for mayor, and I did some speechifying for him, but by that time I was in practice, trying to get my practice started, so I really didn't have enough time to devote as much time to the campaign. Maynard and I continued to be friends for a long, long time. That was really. He always ate too much. He loved ice cream. He just couldn't put it down. He just eat it. And then he had that heart attack in Dulles, LaGuardia, when he was going to Washington, I think, to testify for something. It just broke my heart. Anyway, John, I maintained a relationship with. Brennan had meanwhile moved on to other things, and John took over as director of the Voter Education Project. And it got separately incorporated, and because I was working on a book, an article about the campaign in the New South, which I provided I stayed in contact with John. He would later run for city council, and I kind of helped him a little bit. Of course, I was in DeKalb County, which is in Atlanta. He won that. But then he decided to run for Congress. And Julian had come back and decided to run as well. And that was a heartbreaking campaign, because these two guys were great friends. And they were running against each other for that seat. It had been occupied by Andrew Young, but he had left. I think at that time he was going to think it was in '76. Excuse me, yeah. No, '86. When Jimmy Carter got elected, and he was going to become ambassador to the United Nations, I believe. So it left that seat open. They ran against each other. And John won. And the only other contact I continued, I talked to, Julian was gone. I wrote him a couple times, but we really didn't have much contact. But I saw John a lot because I introduced him to a couple of programs here in DeKalb County. And he was in Congress. And when I won the judgeship against Oscar Mitchell, and that's a story all by itself. So so at any event, John and I stayed in touch. The last time I saw him, that was about 2 years ago. He was doing, one of the last things he did was to do this kind of comic book about his experiences in the civil rights movement. And he was having a book signing over at Ansley Mall. So, hell, I haven't seen him in 8 years, 10, 15 years, so I guess I'm going to go over. And so I went over there, walked up, and he looked at me and he said, Judge. And I said, John, how you doing? He ran to give me a big hug. Oh, I bought the book. And it's the last time I saw him. So anyway, that's the beginning of the war stories as far as 1968 is concerned. Where would you like to talk about that?
Yeah, so you mentioned Maynard Jackson's campaign in 1973 for mayor. So the next thing that's part of your collection is this letter from Jimmy Carter introducing you as part of the Vietnam Veterans Association in Georgia. So let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it was kind of a strange thing. I set up an office in, not over here, the Pythagoras Masonic Temple building. And down the street was a guy named Bert Westbrook, who was kind of notorious in his own right. He was a West Point graduate, Vietnam veteran, and decorated war veteran. And the Army was going to send him back to Vietnam. And he said, hell no, I'm not going. And so he resigned his commission. So he didn't want to go back to Vietnam. But anyway, he came here and he was tapped by Jimmy Carter to form a Vietnam veterans MIA committee, and he was looking for Vietnam veterans, and I had to be down the street, down the hallway from him. So he asked me to come on, join on. So I did. And we met a few times. To be charitable about it, Jimmy Carter set up the commission because he was anticipating, I suspect, a run for the presidency. And he wanted to get the word out that somehow he was concerned about the supply of Vietnam veterans, which of course was a real problem. So anyway, I was part of the committee. And there were 20 people on the committee, 10 of which were primarily American Legion types, World War II and Korean war types. And they were not sympathetic to the Vietnam veterans. The Vietnam veterans are young, and they were concerned about how they were being treated by the Department of Veteran Services, which is a state agency that contracts with the Veterans Administration to handle veterans' benefits. And they were having a terrible time getting their benefits. I had my own problems with that when I was in my first year of law school, but I finally was able to work it out. I was working with the VA itself. And so they participated, and we all kind of agreed we only had one thing in mind we wanted to do. We wanted an effort to be made to get jobs for Vietnam veterans as they came back. We wanted, like happened for other veterans, assign points for their service and when they apply for a civil service job with the state government. And finally, we wanted to get free tuition in the Georgia colleges. They do otherwise be qualified. They have to be able to qualify, they have to be good veterans, they have to have good grades, they have to meet all those qualifications. But we wanted free tuition. Well, the University of Georgia Board of Regents balked. They weren't going to do that. And so we became a minority report. So when they gave the majority report with Masquina, who was at that time the state senator, speaking for the majority, I spoke in behalf of the minority, saying this is what we want, and we think they should be added. Then at a press conference, it was awfully embarrassing for Jimmy Carter. I don't think he forgot that. But nevertheless, it was had TV coverage, and I was, my notoriety began at that point. But meanwhile, thereafter, I would continue to be a member of the board, and other veterans organizations, the Vietnam veterans, would call me in to speak in various places about what needed to be done as far as benefits for Vietnam veterans. And I got a nice letter. I wrote a letter also to Jimmy Carter, and that's the letter that you have. And he wrote a nice letter saying, thanks, but no thanks. That was in 1972.
And when did you start practicing law? When did you graduate and when did you start practicing law?
I graduated in 1970. I started practicing almost immediately. I worked for a year for a lawyer by the name of Stanley Nyland out in Buckhead. And then I decided I'd form my own practice with Jim Bonner, who'd been my roommate at Emory here in Decatur. That was in 1971. Mm-hmm. And I practiced law. I took anything that came in the door, but
criminal and civil.
Yes, mm-hmm. I did a lot of criminal, did a lot of domestic relations work. Mm-hmm. That's basically what my work was. And I became a pretty good trial lawyer.
So one of the cases that was as part of your collection was an article from the AJC from 1980 about your client, Mr. Walker, who was arrested for marijuana possession. You want to talk about that case?
Yeah, it's a strange story. I could go on and on about that, so I'm going to try to keep it short. I was sitting in my office and I got a call from the Fulton County Volunteer Lawyers Foundation. He said, we don't refer out criminal cases, but we know you do criminal work and you've got a lot of experience. We have this guy named John Walker who's been charged with a crime. And I said, well, I'd like to talk with him. He said that he's on the run. I said, what? He says, yes, he is. He said, well, give me his phone. I'll call him. He said, Mr. Walker, are the police looking for you? And he said, yes, they are. Okay. I want to meet you to be in my office tomorrow at 2 o'clock, and then we're going to go turn you into the police department. But don't tell me where you are. If I do, I have to honor bound to disclose your location to the police. So just go where you want to go, and stay away from, and don't tell me where you're going. So I never did know where I spent that night. Next day I showed up at my office and we talked. And a very good client. You know, defense lawyers dream about having a perfect client. This guy, graduate of Georgia Tech, Eagle Scout. His part-time job, because he's in graduate school at Georgia Tech, the part-time job was working with underprivileged kids in the city of Atlanta. His family, he had his parents were both professors at Florida Atlantic University, and no prior record of any sort. He was charged with this offense. Oh, by the way, the offense was possession of marijuana more than an ounce, 25 tons more than an ounce. So, and according to the article, I didn't know it, but that was the largest drug bust up to that point in DeKalb County. So, what had happened is that one night, a lady lived off of Stephenson Road, had a house that was close to Stephenson Road, but there was a long driveway that went all the way up to a house in back. And that house was isolated. But one night, trucks started driving up that driveway. And she didn't know what was going on because she thought that house was deserted. So she called the police. So the police arrived, blockaded the road. Helicopters came in, and they found the 2 trucks sitting in front of this house and 6 other cars out there because this was a major distribution point for marijuana. And brought in from some other source and spread out. And they made lots of arrests. including 2 people who were on the scene. And they got them, and they made bond immediately, and they disappeared. But it turned out the cops thought that Mr. Walker was involved in it because that used to be at his house, and he had sublet it out to another guy by the name of Goggins. And the other thing was, unfortunately, his car was found there, but he was not there. He was with his girlfriend. He was living with his girlfriend on Euclid Highway, and she would vouch for him as an alibi witness. But the police saw that he was a leaseholder. They saw that he was still getting mail there, even though he wasn't there. I said, okay. So then I said, we're going to go see the police. You ready to go? I said, okay. Now, I'm probably not going to be with you when I turn in. I've already arranged to have bond set, so you should be released pretty fast. And whatever you do when you're police, say nothing. Do nothing. Tell them that your lawyer's outside the door, and I want to talk to your lawyer if you think that's necessary, but make no admissions of any sort. Smart kid. Well, not a kid anymore, but smart enough. So finally I kept waiting and waiting, and the cops wouldn't release it. I waited about 4 hours, and then I said, all right, they did it. I went to see the magistrate court judge. I said, Judge, we've already set a bond in this case, and the cops are holding him, and they won't let him go. He said, I'll take care of that. And he called me. And they let Walker go. And he came in, and I said, what happened? He said, nothing. You didn't say anything, did you? No. Okay. So then the trial was to start. Now, another thing you should remember, the 2 co-defendants had made bond and split. He had the same amount of bond as they had, but he did not split. He made bond and came back. He was facing the charges. And I'm sure they carried a lot of weight with the jury when they heard that. And then we started the trial. After we got the jury selected, the first thing happened is that they put the police officer on and he said, yeah, we talked to Mr. Walker. He confessed to it. Your Honor, excuse the jury, Your Honor, he says that my client made a confession, but according to the law, I have to, as a defense counsel, I had a copy of any potential confession provided to me 10 days before trial, and I didn't get it. Mr. Sheffield, Mike Sheffield was the prosecuting attorney, said, no, sir, we didn't get anything from it. So I said, oh my God. The jury was pretty good. I thought we had a pretty good jury. I said, I have to move for mistrial. So I did. I moved for mistrial. It was granted. And then we went back for trial a second time. And the second time, pretty much the same way, except this time when the cop took the stand, he was kind of sheepish. He said, no, he didn't make these statements. So, and then thereafter, on the evidence, they found on their evidence, his car was there, and he had leased a house at one time, but that's essentially all the evidence they had on him. He was not present, he didn't find any drugs on him whenever they took him to the car. And on the contrary, he had this backstory of his own that was so good. And so that's when I argued, said, if anyone can be convicted on evidence such as these, no one in this county is safe. And they bought it, and the jury bought it. And I've been asked a couple times, do I think that Walker knew anything about it? All I can say is, I don't think so. So anyway.
It's quite a case.
Yeah.
Around that same time, though, in fact, just a month before, there's an article where you are running against Oscar Judge Mitchell for judgeship. So let's talk about that next.
Okay, that came up during the course of the trial because I won the election at that point. This was going to be my last jury trial as an attorney. And somehow in opening statement he said, well, you know, I've been elected as judge of the state court. Objection! And that was a good motion. He should have moved for mistrial at that point, but he didn't. And then the mistrial came on later. And then the second trial, I kept my mouth shut. But that's also a long story because it actually started in 1974. I was called by Bill Brennan, who's a legal aid lawyer indicator, and he said, Chuck, we got a case. I don't know if you want to take it, but she's pro bono, she's got no money. I said, who is it? He said, her name is Brenda And so Brenda came into my office and sat down and we talked. And she was about 21 years old. She had 2 kids, and the fathers were not giving her any child support. And she was working as a server in a barbecue joint down in Atlanta. And she was getting AFDC, child support, welfare. It was a supplement because she had told them what her income was, and they added, AFDC added more to it. Well, she got a new job, and they took that job, and it paid a lot more than what she got, but she didn't tell that to AFDC. And so she filled out an affidavit saying, oh yes, my job is still such and such. So she, in effect, lied. They caught her cold. And so they were going to prosecute her, and she was would be the first one to be prosecuted in the state of Georgia for welfare fraud. They had an attorney general come in to actually prosecute the case, to assist the solicitor who was, this is technically a misdemeanor, so who was actually prosecuting. Well, I had a great friend, a woman by the name of Mary Whiteman, one of the few female lawyers in court in Decatur at that time. And I asked her, would you go over and talk to her and see what you could, and then talk to the solicitor. I talked to Brennan myself, and she was very upfront. She said, yeah, I needed the money. I've got these 2 kids to support, and I'm taking care of my maid Nan who's living with me, and they live in public housing. I'm really worried. And so, okay. So when I went off to Seattle, I had to do something back there. I had a state problem of some sort. And I came back, and Mary had arranged for a plea bargain, and the plea bargain was good. It was basically, she would be on probation, and it would be under the First Offenders Act, so she would still be able to keep her keep whatever benefits she was entitled to and be in public housing and not be evicted for it. And she would pay restitution. It was about $600 over a period of probation. And so we were told that we were going to appear before the Honorable JOSCAR Mission, who I'd never appeared to before at that point. But it was kind of strange. We were asked to come in at 10 o'clock on a Wednesday. Remember, the criminal calendars were on Monday and Tuesday, but we couldn't figure out exactly why. But anyway, we arrived. So we were there, Brenda, Mary Whiteman, and the solicitor made his presentation about what had happened. And then said that they had agreed to a plea bargain, that is to say, the probation sentence, the restitution. Well, and I acknowledged that she would enter a plea, and so she did, in fact, enter a plea. But then Judge Mitchell was about to make the sentence. Judge Mitchell has a bad reputation as far as blacks are concerned. In 1960, he jailed Martin Luther King on a traffic violation. He was driving without a license in Decatur, got caught. He made bond, $25 fine rather than probation. And then he went down to Atlanta, where all the black schools, Spelman, Morehouse, Clark, all of them were having demonstrations at Rich's. And of course, this is 4 years after the Montgomery gas bus boycotts, and he was quite a celebrity. And they really wanted Martin Luther King to help them. And so he went down there, and he was picked up like all the kids. With all the kids. Kids were released, but he wasn't. He was sent over to Judge Mitchell, and Judge Mitchell looked at him and said, well, you violated my probation. I'm going to sentence you to Reedsville Penitentiary for 4 months to serve. Wow. And at that point, the Kennedy presidential campaign got involved, and they intervened, and he finally agreed to an appeals bond. They granted the appeals bond, and the Court of Appeals summarily threw out the sentence. For a while there, Dr. King was in Reedsville for 3 days, and he was in real fear that he might be killed when he was in the prison system. That's the guy who I was facing now with Brenda White. That's actually Brenda White. I saw, he says, we don't appreciate people who violate the law. And then he got into his tirade. You people this, you people that. Go down there and with your Cadillacs drive up to the welfare office. I know what you people are all alike. And by the time he's through, I looked over at my client. She was shrinking and crying. I kind of looked back at Judge Mitchell. I said, just didn't say anything. He just looked at it. He looked at me, and I think he saw that something was passing between the two of us. I don't know exactly what. And then Mary, who's really on the ball, the lawyer, said, come on, let's go over to probation and get this taken care of. So he went that way. And then we left the courtroom kind of stunned and sat down. And then I was reported by, came to Joe Ledley. Judge Ledley's a reporter that I know for the Atlanta Journal. And I said, well, Joe, what are you doing here? He said, we're recovering this case. I said, that's not a big case, it's just a misdemeanor. You guys don't usually cover these things. And he said, well, no, Judge Mitchell called us and said he wanted to come here so I can make a statement about what I think about welfare cheaters. So Mitchell had set this thing up so he was up for re-election that year. He'd set it up in order to make this statement for political purposes. He abused my client. And I was mad as hell. Well, 6 years later, last 5 years later, first my mother passed away quickly. She had been paralyzed with rheumatoid arthritis. Had been paralyzed most of her life. My brother and my dad had taken care of her. And then, first my father died. He had a heart attack. He was getting treatment for cancer in the hospital, and he had a heart attack. Then, within a year, my mother passed away. So I had a little bit of a estate. Not much, just a little bit. But I took part of that money, did some money for kids, or 2 kids' college. I put some money in for retirement. Then I had a little bit of cash left over. I said, I'm going to use that to run against JOSCAR Mission. And so I started the campaign. Nobody thought I had a chance. Mitchell had been a judge for 20 years. He had the total following of the Democratic Party. I was active in the Democratic Party, but the conservative wing of the party, generally was normally called the courthouse gang, was definitely not in favor. So Manuel Maloof, who was running for chair of the county commission, and his opponent, Will Russell, a classmate of mine at Emory, and a fellow Vietnam veteran, also endorsed Oscar Mitchell. And then Pat Jarvis, who was sheriff, county endorsed Judge Mitchell. I had to give no support. Then the Bar Association took a bar poll, and 80% said that I was not qualified to be a judge. 40% said, 60% said Judge Mitchell was wonderful. Well, there was also another bar poll done by the Atlanta Bar Association, and that circulated all the lawyers who belonged to the Atlanta Bar all over the Atlanta area. And they gave me a 60% plus rating and Oscar 40% negative rating. But that didn't get a lot of publicity at that point. So that time I ran into some people. Wayne Pergham and his wife Susan. They both been practicing law, maybe about a year. He's a graduate, both graduates of Emory, and he Yale graduate. And he'd been abused by Oscar in court. He remembered it, didn't like it. And then there was then there was Byron Wyndham, who's an old friend of mine, who was practicing law, trying to get a practice started in Decatur. There was Robert Waller, who was a law student. And, at that time, went teaching school, but going to law school at night. Let's see, and finally there was Ron Jason, who was also a recent Emory graduate, graduated at the same time that Wayne did. But he was a really good, very good, he was a former newspaper man, and he really knew how to do copy, and he would be the titular campaign manager to do all the brochures that we did, and signs and everything else. He was excellent. So I had these 4 people. And then I got the endorsements from both the Atlanta Journal and the Atlanta Constitution. They had 2 separate newspapers. The one from the Atlanta Journal was particularly surprising because that's a conservative very conservative newspaper at that time. But they endorsed me, as did the more liberal Atlanta Constitution. So, meanwhile, a third man ran by the name of Jim Goggins. And Jim Goggins, very nice guy. I don't know exactly sure why he ran. I think he was trying to get some publicity for his own practice or something, because he didn't really put in much of an effort compared to the effort I was making and eventually Oscar would make. But Oscar was absolutely sure he was going to win it in the primary. Well, when the election took place, Oscar got 46% of the vote. I got 43% of the vote. But the balance went to Jim Goggins. And it's always bad news for the incumbent, because when the runoff, usually those people who voted for the person who didn't make the runoff, the challenger, will vote for the challenger. And Oscar all of a sudden was really worried. So he raised a lot of money at that time, $75,000. He was doing television ads, direct mail, newspaper ads. You wouldn't believe the money he spent. I was really glad to see the TV ads, because they could see what kind of guy he was. Big, burly. You have a picture of him, you see what he looks like. He looked like what he is, and a mean cuss. Be that as it may, I won the election, about 56% of the vote. Story of office tells is that after the celebration at the headquarters, Maynard showed up. It was great to see him again. And some other people. He was mayor at that time. As I was driving home, I looked at Gwen at the stop sign. I said, Gwen, you know, I really wanted to beat Oscar Mitchell. That's why I ran. And I don't know if I want to be a judge. And she gave me one of those looks that only a wife can give you. And I said, okay, I'll take the job. So I was a judge. Now, the first order of business, of course, was to hire a bailiff. It's a person who actually controls the courtroom. And so Nesby Thomas had a son. His name was Dwight Thomas. And Dwight Thomas had rented office space for me. And I met him and Lois when they came over to decorate Dwight's office. They were really proud. He was their oldest son. He was getting his own office, so he came over there and they wanted to give him curtains and all that kind of thing. And they were really very nice people. And they actually helped him in the campaign. Originally, he was kind of a community leader in Scottsdale, so I got a lot of votes out of Scottsdale, thanks to his efforts. But anyway, he came back and he said, Judge, I understand you're going to have a bailiff's position. I said, yeah, I'd like to have that job. I said, really? I said, well, I thought about it. First, he's a tall, very good-looking guy, very respectful, somebody you'd want to join the courtroom. Very easygoing manner. He's not going to offend anybody, but he's going to get the job done. He's also black. And he became the first black employee to become a bailiff in DeKalb County, which was all white. You have to realize what DeKalb County was like in 1980. Home of the Ku Klux Klan. There were no black employees except for cleanup crew in the courthouse anywhere. One of the lawyers or defenders, except one. The guy who became a good friend of mine, Mike Hancock, who was later would become a Superior Court Judge, was a public defender, but he was the only public defender that was black. So it kind of shocked a few people, but he was a great politician. As we went around and saw everybody, and they all shook hands and said wonderful things about him. And I said, where'd you find that boy? I said, well, I just worked in my campaign. Well, he's all right. I'm still not clear about you, but he's all right.
We have a letter here that you wrote to Nesby Thomas in 2004, thanking him for his service of many years. How long did he work for you?
6 years.
6 years. I don't think I ever told you how important you were in those first years. Do you want to talk about the Confederate battle flag removal from your courthouse? That was one of your, after you were on the bench.
Yeah, I walked into the courtroom about 2 weeks after, and I never really thought about it. I saw 2 flags over to my left, and I thought, well, those 2 Georgia flags, big deal. And then one day I said, wait a minute. I walked over and looked at it. One was a Georgia flag, which has the stars and bars on it. I would later ban that from my courtroom, but much later. But the other was a true Confederate battle flag, and it had belonged to Judge Mitchell. And I was told by other court officials that he kept it available because on Robert E. Lee's birthday and on Confederate holidays, he'd draped the flag over the entrance to his courtroom, which is at the far end of this building. The far end. It's a very small building, but that's where his courtroom was for a while. And I said, I just gotta go. So the next morning, I ran into Bo Spalding, the guy who wrote the article. And he said, I told Bo, I'm gonna remove a Confederate battle flag from my courtroom, and I'm gonna do it tomorrow morning. I said, well, that's not as much of a story. He said, I don't think so either, but I'll let him know we're gonna get some changes around here. He said, okay, I'll be there. So I came out on the bench, and it was a criminal calendar, and just about everyone there was black, African American. And I said, the Confederate flag used to be the flag of honor, and now it represents an attitude toward race, and as such, it ought not to be in any courtroom. So, Mr. Thomas, would you please remove the flag? So we did. Yeah, and I don't often mention this. Gary Proctor was my court reporter. He carried the staff down. He's a full-blooded Cherokee Indian. He went to law school at Yale, but decided he wanted to be a court reporter. But he carried out the staff. He was smiling. Leslie, straight-faced, didn't say anything. And everybody else was kind of, what was going on? And I didn't think anything of it. That day I came back from lunch, and as I ran into a photographer, I knew he was a photographer. He had 3 cameras. He was a young black guy. So my legal mind caught it. So at any event, he came up to me and said, are you Judge Seeliger? And I said, yeah. He said, I took a picture of your bailiff with the flag. Was that okay? I said, yeah, I don't know why you do that, but sure, that's fine. And then he walked away and got to the elevator. Then he said, Judge Seeliger. I turned around and looked at him and said, thank you. And there were tears in his eyes. That's when I realized maybe a little bit more than I thought. Tuesday, the Atlanta Journal came out with that headline: New DeKalb Judge banishes Confederate flag from court. And Nesby was there. And with the camera, with the flag, and a picture was taken. Nothing happened that night. But by the next day, all hell broke loose. First I got some nice calls from people who kind of agreed with me. And then the other calls started coming in. And I love my secretary, Beverly Alex. She knows what's going on. She doesn't always agree with me, but she's my secretary. And she would get calls, and I would listen to her. She said, hello, Judge Seeliger's office. And he said, he did? You're not kidding. He did. Well, I'll bring it to his attention right away. What was your name? Thank you. I'll tell him to give you a call back. I'll talk to her about it. That's how she answered the phone. All these people calling to complain, and she just smoothed it out. It's funny. But in any event, the next day, that day, it hit the news wires. I got calls from Seattle because a lot of my friends up in Seattle saw NBC News picked it up. The New York Times picked it up. The Washington Post picked it up. And then, worst of all, I've been interviewed before, and I've always call it the lightning, but it really was called a thunderbolt. It was a Ku Klux Klan publication by, I never get those initials, it's either B.J. Stoner or J.B. Stoner. He operated it. And it's a hate paper that went all over the country. And on the front page of that paper, he written Nesby's picture, and then he put my home telephone number, my home address, and the like, and that's when the hate mail started. And I think you have it back at this time, the hate mail that I received about it. And it happened for a while. And they used to call in the middle of the night. Gwen, my wife, and I were sleeping. She said at 2 o'clock, all the calls came out. She picked it up and says, hello? Oh, just a moment. Chuck, it's one of your fans. And then I cut him off pretty fast because I said, well, who are you? And I said, well, I'm not going to tell you, you son of a bitch. I said, quit. So eventually it stopped. But I thought it was important because I think the other thing I didn't mention is that The day after I removed the flag and hit the papers, Judge Mitchell had a press conference outside in front of my courtroom. And the television people came in and wanted to interview me about the flag. And I said, I'm not saying anything. And Judge Mitchell was saying, well, he's through as a politician, he's through in DeKalb County. No way he'll ever get reelected. Well, 40 years later, I was still there. So, at any event, that's how the flag broke out. And Nesby, sadly, about three months ago, Nesby died of cancer. Lois passed away. His wife passed away a couple of months earlier, and I went to see him. It was funeral. And Nesby was never the same. They were deeply in love with each other. And he got a moment of glory though. During my last campaign, I drew opposition, and he helped do the campaign commercial. He said, I think I'd like to remove that damn flag. It's in the commercial. It was beautiful. It was a wonderful job. And then about 2 days before he passed, Channel 11 did a program on me. So they went out to interview him. So once we had his one day of glory, he says, well, I met Chuck, and we did this, and we did that. It was so good. It was one of glory. So anyway,